I'm glad some of you stayed, most of you stayed. I thank you for inviting me here to be part of this celebration. I am especially honored to meet Mr. Mattal. I don't have money enough to be a donor, and I don't have diplomatic skills like some of the rest of you. So I'm surprised that you thought listening to somebody who is a scholar, a dull lecturer, would be a good way to think about Gandhi today. But I'm thankful that you agreed to try that. I was told that 30 minutes is my limit, and I might even cut it shorter than that because I have a feeling you've had a lot to think about throughout the day. But professors get 50 minutes, you know, and you get in habits that are very hard to break. So I have my watch here. You can do things like wave your arms if I actually get close to 50 minutes. My talk today is called Religion, Violence, and Gandhi. I have always thought of Gandhi primarily as a brilliant political analyst. I know he can also be thought of as a saint who taught people how to be nonviolent, but he was able to figure out the nature of violence in his day and anticipate the nature of violence that would come with the end of the colonial era in a way that is quite stunning and quite amazing. So what I want to ask you to think with me about this afternoon is the new forms of violence that we are experiencing in our day. And I will try to fill in some of the gaps between Gandhi's time and ours so that we can sort of take his insights to the present time and ask what insight he would bring to understanding the violence that we're seeing in the news each night. As most of you know, Gandhi was born into a traditional religious atmosphere. As he remembered it, the most significant feature of that religious setting was that it had great variety. His father and mother had very different religious practices. His father was personally illiterate in that he could not read the religious texts himself, but he took great care to have both Hindu and Jain texts read to him by scholars. Gandhi remembers that as a rather boring experience, but his father took it as a very important religious duty. His mother was uninterested in these text readings, but she went to a number of temples and specifically went daily to the temple that had Hindu, Jain, and Muslim symbols combined. She also took great care to keep many fasts that she had learned from other women. Gandhi was aware that there were myths of violence in the religious texts, and that courage and discipline, sometimes thought of as military virtues, were also religious virtues. But he assumed that religious teachers normally kept their distance from political leaders. And he also assumed that his own religious life should consist in his unrelenting pursuit of truth. He had no reason to think that religion was prescribed and required in the way that he discovered it was for so many other people. His first suspicion that the colonial understanding of religion was different from his own came when, as a child, he was told by a Christian preacher on the street corner that he would go to hell if he did not change his whole identity and become a Christian. He was very upset by this. He remembers it in his writing of his autobiography. When he went to England at 19, however, he found the lower-class Christian landladies with whom he lived during his 3 years there, much like his mother, in that they were dedicated and careful about their traditional religious practice. So he was more than happy to join with them and go to church on a regular basis and read the Bible that they offered him. He tried to continue this practice when he got to South Africa. But there he was working more with the colonial authorities on a day-to-day basis. And he was confronted time and time again with the awareness that for the colonial mind, there was only one model of civilization. They made clear to him that he was a fool to think that he could also speak of Indian civilization, or that he could imagine that he would have the same rights as an Englishman who was at the pinnacle of civilization. What he finally realized was that supporting this argument about civilization was the argument of the preacher on the street corner. Christians had built one acceptable civilization based on the Christian argument, and they were prepared to, we've used this word, he didn't use it, orientalize, which means to caricature and mock in your descriptions the other religious forms. So the local forms of religion are orientalized and made to look silly. And they were prepared with this analysis of civilization to not only caricature the Indian religions, but to throw people like Gandhi off the train, as we just heard, if they did not acknowledge the colonial package, this whole package that went together. So religion, as he came to understand it in the colonial mind, was a modified product from what he grew up experiencing, and it was designed primarily to serve a political purpose and sustain and give credence to the empire. By 1910, Gandhi was sure he had understood this argument aright. And in a small book called Hind Swaraj, which he wrote during a journey back from London to South Africa after a long period of petitioning the government, he wrote a white-hot diatribe condemning the logic of this colonial position. In this book, he mercilessly mocks the argument that any group should have a monopoly on civilization. And he goes on to point out some of the moral flaws, as he saw them, in British civilization, and to answer some of the critiques he had heard of India. Did I say British civilization? Let me start that sentence and make sure you get it, the right civilization right. He mocks them for thinking that there can be a monopoly of civilization, and goes on to point out the moral flaws of British civilization and answer some of the critiques that he had heard of Indian civilization. That is his most important statement probably ever of what he understood the central flaw to be in the colonial self-understanding. What is, in a way, it's a side issue in some sense, but most interesting about this little book, however, is that it includes an appendix. He had time to write some more. And he suddenly turns on Hindu leaders. And these are people he seems to have met in London, and accuses them too of adopting the same definition of religion used by the colonial leaders. He argues that in their effort to challenge the British, the Hindu leaders had adopted the British idea of religion, in that they treated it as a vehicle for building empire, or at least their own political power base. In parenthesis, we now know that the Hindu leaders, he only calls them that in the book, but we now know that much of his, I think it was 3 months that he was in London, was spent in conversation with V.D. Savarkar, who would later become the primary advocate for using violence in support of the Hindu religious community. And it was this Savarkar who founded the Hindu Mahasabha, and it was the Hindu Mahasabha which was the organization from which Gandhi's assassin came. Just a further point on his attitude toward the colonial. Many people have wondered at Gandhi's strong opposition to Christian mission work in India, even when many times the missionaries were doing social programs parallel and very close to the kind of social programs he was doing. The reason for this is that he saw missionary work, especially missionary work, as deeply linked with this idea of civilizational superiority. He was so clear about this that even those who supported Swami Vivekananda, who had just about this time created a huge name for himself by going to the World Parliament of Religions in Chicago in 1892. Even Swami Vivekananda does not get Gandhi's support. There isn't this savage critique of Swami Vivekananda, because Vivekananda was an older man and had already been to Chicago when Gandhi was just finishing his studies. But it is very clear that the style of Vivekananda's argument is the same as the British argument. There is one superior civilization. The only difference was Vivekananda thought that India could take that claim up because it had the superior spiritual civilization. And it was the same kind of missionary competition and political style of argument that religion was a ideological force that we could fight with in challenging other people in their own civilizational way. So that's Gandhi in his battles with the colonial understanding of religion, and he understood every event in the life of the Indians in South Africa that he was working with, and in the life of the people of India, as violence perpetrated on them by the state, which thought that it had a freedom to be as violent as necessary in order to demonstrate the superiority of its religious based civilization. I want to go on, however, to talk about Gandhi's anticipation of the post-colonial situation that would arise after the British were gone, because there too he was concerned about the definition of religion and the nature of the violence that would be inevitably perpetrated. Gandhi has associated most people's minds with the liberation struggle against colonialism. He is, however, today also spoken of as a pioneer in post-colonial studies, because he was so deeply concerned about what would happen at the end of the colonial era. Once again, he saw religion being modified, a different modification, to serve a political end, and becoming more shallow and more dangerous in that process. In this context, he objected to the way different communal claims to a new homeland led on to ethnic conflict and the violent displacement of other ethnic people. So it's a different style of understanding religion as a communal unit, and it's a different style of violence because it's not careful imperial violence, it's ethnic conflict violence that he's fighting in this case. Early in the last century, many people were sympathetic when Jewish religious leaders reflected on their years of unhappiness within European society and began the Zionist movement in the hope of establishing a homeland in Palestine. What many did not notice in that post-colonial context, when the identity of many groups were shifting, was that the Jewish leaders were assuming it was all right to use violence to take some of the Palestinian territory. When Gandhi heard about some of the first violence, in the 1930s this was, he wrote a careful letter to the great Jewish theologian Martin Buber, arguing that the use of violence was not justified and hoping that the Jewish leaders could see how they could share the territory with the Palestinian peasants. Buber wrote back vehemently defending his position and ignoring Gandhi's advice. We now know that that initial violence was the tip of a huge iceberg, and that the initial violence has led to a spiral of violence, and that violence continues in that area and seems now to be drawing larger and larger areas into its powerful orbit. The place, of course, where most outside observers thought the communal violence would be most severe was in the Indian subcontinent, because there were 20% Muslims, 5% Sikhs, 5% Christians, and they had to find a way to live with the 70% Hindu majority. Gandhi argued furiously that even to pose the problem in that communal way was wrong, and that a variety of religious life was a blessing to any society. Jinnah is the crucial figure in this. He is the exact opposite of Gandhi, in that he had no roots in traditional religious practice and did not even support the Muslim version of the imperialist style of understanding religion, which had been present in the medieval Muslim empires and continued in a kind of broken way in the dreams for a caliphate or for a unified Arab state. Jinnah had almost a cynical view and was only interested in religion as something that could be manipulated to create a unified social unit and therefore a powerful state. The violent breakup of his original Pakistan state into Pakistan and Bangladesh makes clear how fragile the idea of using religion as a basis for defining statehood really is. It just does not work. The Sikh quest for a homeland of Khalistan followed closely the same style of the quest expressed by Jinnah. Because the community, the Sikh community, was much smaller, the methods of communal organization were somewhat more effective in this case, and the variety of traditional religious practice disappeared more completely. The reforms were more effective than they were even in the Muslim case. As a result, what we see in the case of Sikhism is both a more complete transformation of religion into a communal form and a number of very intense experiences of violence in the decades to follow. While Gandhi's fierce opposition to the development of communal religious forms cost him his life, post-colonial India clung to the hope that he was right and that religion did not need to be manipulated into a communal form in order to give society its necessary strength. The post-colonial era was a confusing one because it seemed to be a time of liberation and secularism, and yet it saw religion recycled as communalism and saw it lead to a good many examples of ethnic conflict and bitter violence. The colonial era had seen traditional religion transformed to serve a political master, but there had been nobility in the role religion had been given in defining the civilization the empire proposed. In the post-colonial era, the task religion was given was to create a communal consciousness, and in many contexts that actually took away individual freedom and even destroyed the rich traditions of religious practice. It should be said that in many situations, post-colonial societies did not move in a communal direction and realized early on that there were major differences in the religious backgrounds of their members and decided that they would encourage religious variety, the pluralism that Professor Jagmohan was talking about. Guyana and Trinidad might be cited as examples where this last strategy worked quite well. Sri Lanka might be cited as an example where it was badly needed, but was not tried. Finally, let's talk about the third era. The issues we are dealing with today take their form initially from a new set of political arrangements, and with all the political scientists around and diplomats and everything, I will not say much about this, except I will give you the word globalization. Everybody loves that word. Some of the features of this new era are at least benign, and a few have changed our life in wonderful ways. To take those that are closest to my experience, I do not know what I would have done without the multicultural revolution that has so changed Canada, and particularly her universities in the past generation, and particularly Carleton after today. And if the incredible India, you see these ads on the TV every day, ads are correct, I take it the poverty of India I experienced firsthand 50 years ago is a thing of the past. These are products of globalization and wonderful products. What I guess no one would have expected to see mixed in with these exciting changes is the sense of homelessness that now haunts so many individuals, and the random violence that some of these people bring to our newscasts every night. I just said positive things about the way in which Guyana and Trinidad used the openness of the post-colonial society to achieve new forms of cultural hybridity. But it was in a book of poetry by Canadian Caribbean authors that I first heard about this sense of homelessness. As they said, these are the Caribbean poets, when you belong to three cultures, you belong to none. And CBC last week, I think, very recently, gave us a detailed account of the life of the Sikh boy who last year took his guns to Dawson College to do violence to his classmates and himself. And there too, in that story, one could sense the word homelessness and how it was eventually to wreak havoc. What links this random violence back with our theme is that the media at least focuses in on the religious links said to be motivating factors in some of these most dramatic acts of violence. Let me quickly give you the two examples that came to my mind as I was preparing this week. First of all, our old friend Osama bin Laden was back and sent us a new video in which he clearly seems to have dressed up like Jesus and is in a teaching mode. If I understood his teaching, it seems to be that those of us in the West need to turn to Islam. Once again, this video opens up the question whether this guy is some kind of a prophet or just a violent fool. The other example for me was when a friend this week told me about the shrine in Sri Lanka where thousands now go on pilgrimage to revere the memory of the woman they call Danu. She is the woman who pushed through the crowd to touch Rajiv Gandhi's feet just before she blew him up and, of course, blew herself up. What we clearly have in these examples is religion, once again, being used for a political purpose. These perpetrators of violence are not religious persons, in that they follow traditional religious practices or are acting in accord with a traditional religious teaching. They are homeless individuals, and with no national or group identity to give them meaning, they reach back into a pre-modern past for just a touch of religious symbolism. The press fills in the details and tries to make sense of these stray religious symbols and tells us that the 9/11 pilots really did expect to meet exotic dancers in heaven, or they really were obeying Quranic verses on jihad. My friend now wants me to take seriously that Danu, this lady whose real name is Tenmoli Rajaratnam, did feel like a future Hindu goddess when she blew herself up. If I am right, what we are witnessing is a continuation of the trend Gandhi so lamented, where religion is manipulated for political purposes, and the result is a shallower and shallower resort to meaningless violence. Colonial violence could be cold and brutal, as Gandhi knew, but it at least thought it had a religious purpose, at the beginning at least. Post-colonial ethnic violence had a very specific religious purpose, but it was in the narrow perspective of the community involved, and its violence quickly became an end in itself, and today brings wave after wave of violence back into the lives of those communities. You can think Israel, you can think Pakistan, you can think Sri Lankan Tamils, wherever you want to go. It hasn't worked. Globalized random violence is a product produced for the global media and has absolutely no purpose in the lives of those nearest to the actors involved, except perhaps to visit on them further violence from others. Is there an alternative? Can I leave you with any hope? Or are we on a downward course from one step to another? I don't think so. I think I can. In some sense, these patterns of misinterpreting religion and creating new forms of violence have a cycle built into them. Gandhi understood human nature to be essentially good. People on their own outgrow their infant urges to gratify their five senses and to hit people and so forth. They gradually develop an emotional life, a mental life, a personal character, and sometimes a full spiritual life and a sense of the universal good. The problem is that this development gets disrupted when personal crises or political developments bring violent interruption into what is a natural spiritual growth process. The good news is that people and societies wake up when the meaninglessness of violence surprises them, and then they begin to see the violence for what it really is. Rwanda went through the worst experience of violence any of us have heard of. But it has found its way back. And this week announced that it will soon be the first country in the world where every citizen has a computer and a cell phone. Tribal conflict may not be forever gone, but for now it's gone. 50 years ago, India was reeling from the fears surrounding decolonization. Today, things, we're told, are better. Brutal oppression in Myanmar this week has been hard to watch, but many of those who have experienced it directly seem to still live with hope and are acting with great courage. I'm thankful to be able to share some of these thoughts with you on Gandhi's birth celebration, but I'm also even more thankful to be able to imagine that you affirm with me that we will continue to patiently pursue the quest for truth, whatever the day-to-day news may say. Thank you.